The cold was a constant companion. It lived in the marrow of her bones, a parasite that fed on any flicker of warmth she might find. Alara shifted her weight, the worn leather of her boots groaning in protest. Ice had seeped through a crack in the sole, and her toes were numb, distant things that barely felt like her own. She was on her knees in the great hall's courtyard, scrubbing the flagstones with a coarse brush and a bucket of frigid water. The wind, a cruel beast from the northern peaks, sliced at the exposed skin of her face and hands. Each gust was like a whip, leaving trails of stinging fire in its wake. This was her life, a cycle of cold, hunger, and pain, punctuated by the sharp glares and sharper words of the Blackwood pack. She was an omega, an orphan, a ghost who haunted the edges of their society, less than nothing, a stain they tolerated only because the law demanded it. Her hands were raw, the skin cracked and bleeding around her knuckles. She dunked the brush back into the bucket, the icy water a fresh shock of agony. She gritted her teeth, a small, defiant sound lost to the howling wind. Breaking was not an option. It was the one thing they wanted, the one thing she would never give them. "Still at it, little rat?" The voice was slick with contempt. Alara didn't need to look up. She knew that voice, knew the cloying scent of winter rose perfume that always preceded it. Lyra, daughter of the pack's beta, a she-wolf whose beauty was as sharp and cold as a shard of ice. Alara kept her eyes fixed on the stone in front of her, scrubbing with a renewed, desperate vigor. Acknowledging her would only make it worse. "I'm speaking to you, filth!" A pointed boot, trimmed with expensive fur, nudged her ribs. It was not a hard kick, but it was laden with a weight of humiliation that stole her breath. She finally looked up, her gaze meeting Lyra's. Lyra's eyes were the color of a frozen lake and just as welcoming. A cruel smile played on her perfect lips. "You missed a spot." Lyra gestured with a dismissive flick of her wrist. Then, with deliberate slowness, she tipped over the heavy wooden bucket. Icy water, gray with grime, cascaded over Alara's legs, soaking through her thin trousers in an instant. The cold was so intense it was like being burned. A gasp escaped her lips, a plume of white in the frigid air. Lyra laughed, a sound like tinkling bells made of ice. "Clumsy me. You'll have to fetch more water from the well. Try not to take all day this time." She turned and sauntered away, her fur-lined cloak sweeping behind her, leaving Alara shivering violently on the frozen ground. The water was already starting to freeze to her clothes, stiffening the fabric, locking the cold against her skin. Rage, hot and useless, warred with a familiar, crushing despair. What was the point? What was the point of enduring? Of scrubbing stones that would only be dirtied again? Of living a life where her only purpose was to be a target for someone else's cruelty? But then, something else rose through the despair. A stubborn, gritty thing that had taken root in her soul long ago. She would not freeze here. She would not give Lyra the satisfaction. Slowly, painfully, Alara pushed herself up. Her muscles screamed, her joints ached with a cold so deep it felt permanent. She picked up the empty bucket, her fingers sticking to the frozen wood. She would get more water. She would finish her work. She would survive this day just as she had survived all the others. It was all she knew how to do. Later that evening, the storm broke. It did not arrive gently. It descended upon the mountains like a god's fury, a maelstrom of wind and snow that blotted out the sky. The world beyond the pack hall's thick walls became a churning vortex of white. Alara was huddled near the kitchens, trying to absorb some of the residual heat from the hearth, when Lyra found her again. Her face was flushed with excitement, her eyes bright with malice. "The Alpha requires firewood for his private study," Lyra announced, her voice carrying over the roar of the wind. "The main stores are low. You'll have to go to the old woodshed at the edge of the territory." Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through Alara's exhaustion. The old woodshed was a half-day's walk in good weather. In this blizzard, it was a death sentence. "But the storm," Alara whispered, her voice barely audible. Lyra's smile widened. "Are you questioning an order, Omega? Perhaps you'd prefer a night in the ice cells to reflect on your insubordination." The ice cells. A place of absolute darkness and cold, where even the strongest wolves had been broken. No, anything but that. Alara bowed her head, the fight draining out of her. "No, I will go." "Good girl." Lyra patted her head, a condescending gesture that made Alara's skin crawl. "Take the old sled, and try not to get lost. It would be such a shame to lose our best stone scrubber." Wrapped in a threadbare cloak that offered little protection, Alara pushed the rickety sled into the teeth of the blizzard. The force of the wind was a physical blow, staggering her, trying to force her back. Snow, as fine and sharp as sand, blasted her face, stinging her eyes and clogging her throat. Within minutes, the lights of the pack hall were swallowed by the swirling white chaos. She was alone, utterly and completely alone in a world that had turned hostile. She pushed on, her world shrinking to the few feet of churning snow in front of her. The path was gone, buried. She navigated by instinct, by the faint memory of the trees that lined the way. But the wind was a disorienting roar, and the snow was a blinding curtain. What was happening to me? Was this it? Was this how her miserable life was meant to end? Frozen and forgotten in a storm, a task meant to kill her finally succeeding. The thought brought a strange sense of peace. No more scrubbing, no more hunger, no more Lyra. Her legs grew heavy, leaden things that refused to obey. The sled felt like it was anchored to the mountain itself. She stumbled, falling to her knees in a deep drift. The snow was soft, almost welcoming. It would be so easy to just lie down, to close her eyes and let the cold take her. She was so tired, so very tired. Her eyelids fluttered, heavy as stones. The world was fading, the roar of the wind softening to a distant lullaby. Just a moment of rest. That was all she needed. Something broke the white monotony. A shape, dark and immense, moving through the storm. It was huge, far larger than any wolf of her pack. A beast, perhaps. A winter bear roused from its slumber. Fear gave her a last, desperate jolt of energy. She tried to scramble back, but her limbs were numb, useless. The shape resolved itself, stepping out of the blizzard's haze. It was not a bear. It was a man. Or something like a man. He was impossibly tall, broad-shouldered enough to block out the storm. He wore dark furs that seemed to drink the light, and snow clung to him without melting. His face was all harsh lines and sharp angles, beautiful in a way that was terrifying, like a perfectly forged weapon. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were not human. They glowed with an internal light, a liquid, molten gold that seemed to burn away the cold. They fixed on her, and she felt seen, truly seen, for the first time in her life. Not as an Omega, not as filth, but as something. He took a step toward her, his movements fluid and predatory. He moved with an ancient grace that spoke of immense power held in perfect control. The snow did not seem to impede him at all. He stopped just before her, looking down at her crumpled form. The air around him felt different, charged with an energy that made the hairs on her arms stand up. The scent of pine and winter storms and something else, something wild and male and powerful, filled her senses. She should have been terrified. She was. But beneath the terror was a strange, inexplicable pull, a sense of recognition deep in her soul that made no sense. He knelt, the motion effortless. The sheer scale of him was overwhelming. He reached out a hand, large and calloused, and brushed the snow from her cheek. The moment his skin touched hers, the world exploded. It was not a sound. It was a feeling. A cataclysmic detonation of heat and light and searing, unbearable pain that erupted from the point of contact. It was a brand of pure fire on her skin, a scream that tore from her throat without making a sound. Her vision went white. The blizzard, the man, the world, it all vanished, replaced by an incandescent agony. Something was being burned into her, rewritten into the very fabric of her being. She felt a connection snap into place, a cord of brilliant energy lashing her soul to his. She was falling, tumbling through a vortex of golden light and excruciating sensation. His essence flooded her. Ancient loneliness, the weight of centuries, a fierce, possessive power that was terrifying and yet comforting. She felt his shock, his disbelief, his overwhelming, soul-shaking recognition. Then, as quickly as it began, the searing pain coalesced, shrinking to a single point on her collarbone. The light receded, and the world rushed back in. She was lying in the snow, cradled in his arms. The blizzard still raged, but she could no longer feel the cold. A profound warmth spread from his body into hers, a deep, vital heat that chased the chill from her bones. His golden eyes were wide, blazing with an intensity that pinned her in place. He looked from her eyes down to her collarbone, where the thin fabric of her tunic had been singed away. She followed his gaze. There, on her skin, was a mark. It was intricate, a swirling pattern of a wolf and a crescent moon, glowing with a soft, silvery light against her pale skin. It pulsed with a gentle warmth, a perfect match to the heat radiating from him. He lifted his gaze back to hers. His expression was one of stunned, reverent awe. Awe directed at her, at Alara. It was a look no one had ever given her. A single word left his lips, a low rumble that was less a sound and more a vibration she felt in her very soul. Mine. The word was not a question. It was a statement of fact, a declaration that changed everything. It settled over her, a cloak of possession so absolute it was terrifying. Her mind, reeling from the pain and the shock, screamed at her to run, to flee from this impossible man and his burning golden eyes. But her body, her very soul, did the opposite. It leaned into him, seeking his warmth, his strength. This stranger who had branded her with light. This man who looked at her as if she were a treasure he had spent a lifetime seeking. What did you do to me?" she whispered, her voice hoarse and thin against the storm's roar. His harsh features softened, a subtle shift that was devastating in its tenderness. He gently traced the edge of the glowing mark on her skin with his thumb, sending a shiver of pure sensation through her. It wasn't pain. It was something else. Something she had no name for. "I found you," he said, his voice deep as thunder. You're her, the one I have been waiting for. Her. Who was her? She was Alara, the Omega, the worthless one, the girl sent to die in a storm. This had to be a dream, a hallucination brought on by the cold. She was freezing to death, and her dying mind had conjured this impossible savior. I don't understand, she stammered, confusion warring with a burgeoning, terrifying hope. He scooped her up into his arms as if she weighed nothing. The furs of his cloak enveloped her, a cocoon of warmth and the intoxicating scent of pine and power. He held her against his chest, a wall of solid muscle and heat. She could feel the steady, powerful beat of his heart against her ear. You will, he promised, his voice a low murmur against her hair. I have you now. Nothing will ever harm you again. He began to walk, striding through the blizzard as if it were a mild spring breeze. The wind did not seem to touch them. The snow did not dare to impede his path. He moved with a purpose and certainty that was absolute. Alara lay against him, overwhelmed and trembling. The glowing mark on her collarbone pulsed in time with his heartbeat. The bond, a living thing, hummed between them. She was terrified. She was confused. She was in more pain than she had ever known, and yet she felt safer than she had ever been in her life. Who was this man? What was this mark? What was happening to her? She didn't know how long he walked. Time seemed to have dissolved in the golden blaze of his eyes and the steady rhythm of his heart. She drifted in and out of consciousness, lulled by the impossible warmth and the feeling of being held, truly held, for the first time. Eventually, he stopped. He had found shelter, a shallow cave carved into the base of a rock outcropping, shielded from the worst of the wind. He gently set her down on a bed of his own furs, which he laid over the frozen ground. He built a fire with an efficiency that was mesmerizing. He seemed to coax the flames from the damp wood with his will alone. Soon, a small but powerful fire crackled to life, casting flickering shadows on the cave walls and filling the small space with blessed heat. Alara watched him, huddled in the furs. He moved with an economy of motion, every action precise and powerful. He was the most magnificent and terrifying creature she had ever seen. The alpha of her pack, a notoriously cruel and powerful wolf, would look like a pup next to this man. "Who are you?" she asked again, her voice a little stronger now. He turned from the fire, his golden eyes finding hers in the dim light. "I am Kale." The name meant nothing to her, yet it felt like it should. It felt ancient, heavy with power. "And you," he continued, his gaze intense, "are my mate." Mate. The word hung in the air between them. It was a sacred, impossible word. Mates were rare, a blessing from the moon goddess herself, and they were certainly not for Omegas. An Omega could never be mated to an Alpha, let alone whatever he was. "That's not possible," she said, shaking her head. I'm an Omega. I am nothing." The words were automatic, a catechism of worthlessness she had recited to herself her entire life. A low growl rumbled in his chest, a dangerous sound that made the air vibrate. His eyes flared, the gold deepening to a burning amber. "Do not ever say that again." The command was absolute, leaving no room for argument. It wasn't a shout, but it held more power than any shout she had ever heard. "You are not nothing," he said, his voice softening again, though the intensity remained. "You are the other half of my soul, the queen my kingdom has awaited for 500 years. 500 years. A kingdom. The words spun in her head, nonsensical. This man was insane. A powerful, beautiful, insane man who had saved her from a blizzard. He saw the disbelief on her face. A flicker of something. Pain? Loneliness? Crossed his features. The bond does not lie, little one. Feel it. He reached out, not touching her, but hovering his hand over the mark on her collarbone. She did as he said. She closed her eyes and focused on the strange new connection inside her. It was a humming thread of gold, warm and strong, leading directly from her to him. Through it, she could feel him. Not his thoughts, but his emotions, the fierce possessiveness, the bone-deep relief, the overwhelming protective adoration. It was too much. She gasped, her eyes flying open. It was real. This was all real. He gave her a small, sad smile. It was a devastating sight on his harsh face. It will take time to understand. Rest now. You are safe. He said it with such certainty. Safe. It was a foreign concept, a word from a language she had never learned. But lying there, wrapped in his furs, warmed by his fire, with his powerful presence guarding the mouth of the cave, she began to believe it might be true. For the first time in her memory, Alara slept without fear. She slept deeply, dreamlessly, anchored by the steady warmth of the bond and the presence of the golden-eyed king who called her his. The search party from the Blackwood Pack found the cave at dawn. The blizzard had broken, leaving the world blanketed in a pristine, silent layer of snow. Alara was awake, sharing a piece of dried meat Kale had produced from a pack she hadn't noticed before. It was the best thing she had ever tasted. He sat close, not touching, but his proximity was a constant warm pressure against her senses. Then she heard the voices. Familiar, unwelcome voices. "Over here! The tracks lead to this cave!" It was Vorlag, a brutish, arrogant wolf from her pack, who had long considered her his personal property to torment. And with him, she heard Lyra's sharp, impatient tones. Panic seized her. A cold dread that had nothing to do with the temperature. They had found her. They would drag her back to the scrubbing, the beatings, the endless humiliation. The fragile bubble of safety Kale had created shattered. Kale's head came up, his golden eyes narrowing. A low growl started in his chest, a sound that was pure predator. He stood, placing himself between Alara and the cave entrance. He was a mountain of silent, lethal fury. Vorlag and Lyra appeared at the mouth of the cave, their faces a mixture of relief and annoyance. Then they saw Kale. They froze. Their eyes widened, taking in his immense size, the palpable aura of ancient power that rolled off him in waves. This was no lost traveler. This was something else entirely. Vorlag, ever the fool, puffed out his chest. "Who are you? And what are you doing with our Omega?" Kale didn't answer. He simply looked at them, his expression one of utter contempt. It was the look a wolf might give a pair of insects before crushing them. Lyra's gaze, however, was sharper. It flickered past Kale to Alara, huddled in the furs, and it landed on the pale, silvery glow of the mark on her collarbone. Her perfectly shaped mouth fell open. A gasp of pure, venomous jealousy escaped her. She knew what that mark meant. Every she-wolf dreamed of receiving one, a true mate bond. That's impossible, Lyra breathed, her face contorting with ugly disbelief. Her? Mated? To you? Vorlag followed her gaze. When he saw the mark, his face turned purple with rage. He had always seen Alara as a thing to be used and discarded. To see her claimed, and by someone so obviously powerful, was an intolerable insult to his pride. "You have branded our property, stranger," Vorlag snarled, his hand moving to the hilt of the hunting knife at his belt. "She belongs to the Blackwood pack. You will release her to us. Now." Kale's lips curled back from his teeth in a silent, terrifying snarl. The air in the cave grew thick, heavy. "She belongs to no one but me. She is my mate, and you will leave this place before I tear the flesh from your bones." His voice was unnervingly calm, but it held the promise of swift, brutal violence. Even Vorlag, in his arrogance, took an involuntary step back. But then he looked at Alara again. He saw her not as a person, but as a key, a weakness, a way to gain leverage over this powerful stranger. A plan began to form in his cunning, cruel mind. "We will be back for what is ours," Vorlag said, his eyes glinting. He grabbed Lyra's arm and pulled her back, away from the cave. Lyra resisted for a moment, her face a mask of pure hatred directed at Alara. Then she allowed Vorlag to drag her away. They disappeared from the cave entrance, their angry voices fading into the snow-muffled landscape. Alara was trembling. The encounter had left her feeling exposed, terrified. The old fear was back, a familiar poison in her veins. Kale turned to her, the fury draining from his face, replaced by a fierce concern. He knelt before her, taking her cold hands in his. "They will not touch you. I swear it on my life." "You don't understand," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "They won't stop. Vorlag, he's cruel. And Lyra hates me." "They'll come back with the whole pack." "Let them come," Kale said, his voice a hard, rumbling promise. "Let them come and break themselves against me." He lifted her chin, forcing her to meet his blazing golden eyes. "You are the Alpha Queen now, Alara. Your days of bowing to curs like them are over." Alpha Queen. The title was so absurd, so far beyond anything she could imagine, that a hysterical laugh almost escaped her. But looking into his eyes, she saw he was completely serious. He believed it. And for a wild, terrifying moment, a tiny part of her wanted to believe it too. He told her they had to leave, to get to his own territory before the Blackwood pack could rally. He explained that he had been tracking a rogue beast when the storm hit, which was why he was alone. His warriors were a day's ride away. "I must deal with the beast," he said, his expression grim. "It threatens the passes. I will be fast. Stay here. Keep the fire high. Do not leave the cave." Fear coiled in her stomach. "Don't go. Please." The words were out before she could stop them. She hated the weakness in her voice, but the thought of being alone again was unbearable. He touched her cheek, his calloused thumb stroking her skin. The tenderness of the gesture was her undoing. "I will not be long. I will always come back for you." He stood, a formidable shadow against the bright snow outside, and then he was gone. The cave suddenly felt vast and empty without him. The warmth of the fire seemed lesser, the shadows deeper. Alara huddled by the flames, clutching the fur cloak around her. The bond was a thrumming presence inside her, a constant reminder of him. It was a comfort, but it also felt fragile, a connection that could be severed. She must have dozed off, lulled by the fire's warmth and her own exhaustion. She awoke with a start, the sense of being watched prickling at the back of her neck. The fire had burned low, and standing in the mouth of the cave were not Kael, but Vorlag and two of his largest cronies. And this time, They held thick, gleaming chains in their hands. Silver. Her blood ran cold. Silver was poison to their kind, a metal that burned their skin, and in large enough quantities could dampen even the strongest alpha's power. "The big man left you all alone," Vorlag sneered, advancing into the cave. His eyes were fixed on the glowing mark on her collarbone, a look of greedy triumph on his face. Poor choice. Alara scrambled backward, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Stay away from me!" Her voice was a pathetic squeak. She was trapped. There was nowhere to run. They were on her in an instant. She fought, kicking and scratching with a ferocity that surprised even herself, but she was no match for 3 strong males. One of them grabbed her arms, twisting them behind her back. Then Vorlag pressed the silver chain against the mark on her collarbone. The pain was blinding. It was 1,000 times worse than the bond's formation. It was not a clean fire, but a foul, corrosive acid that ate at her skin and her very soul. It felt like he was trying to tear the bond out of her by the roots. She screamed, a raw, agonized sound that was swallowed by the vast, snowy landscape. The silvery light of her mark sputtered and dimmed, smothered by the corrupting touch of the metal. The golden thread connecting her to Kale frayed, thinning to a near breaking point. The sudden loss of his presence, his warmth, was an agony all its own. They bound her hands and feet with the silver chains, the metal burning cold against her skin. They dragged her from the cave out into the glaring sunlight. "You're going to be very useful, little Omega," Vorlag grunted, hauling her onto a sled. "Turns out your new mate is Kale, the Alpha King himself. The Ember Covenant will pay a high price for the King's weakness." Ember Covenant. Alpha King. The words meant little through the haze of her pain. All she knew was the searing agony of the silver and the terrifying, yawning void where Kale's presence had been. They traveled for hours, moving deeper into the mountains. Alara drifted in a sea of pain, barely conscious. The world was a blur of white snow and gray sky. The bond was a faint, desperate flicker, a dying ember in the cold darkness that was consuming her. She was worthless, after all. A weakness, a trap. Kale had called her a queen, but she was just bait. And now she had been taken. She had failed him. They made camp in a hidden valley as dusk began to fall. They chained her to a frozen tree, far from their fire. The cold seeped back into her bones, more vicious than ever before. Despair was a physical weight, crushing the air from her lungs. This was worse than death. This was a living hell of pain and loss and utter hopelessness. She closed her eyes, tears freezing on her cheeks. She focused on the last, fragile thread of the bond. She poured all of her will, all of her desperation into that single point of connection. Kale. His name was not a word, but a silent scream in her soul. For a moment, there was nothing, only the echoing emptiness. Then, a response. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. A low rumble of pure, murderous rage that resonated through the bond. Hold on. The voice was not in her ears, but inside her head. His voice, deep, powerful, and utterly furious. "I am coming." A tiny spark of hope ignited in the desolate landscape of her heart. He knew. He was coming. She just had to hold on. Later, another figure arrived at the camp. This one moved with a chilling silence, wrapped in shadows even in the firelight. He was tall and lean, his face obscured by a deep hood. But when he looked at her, she saw eyes that burned like red coals. "So this is the king's lost treasure," the newcomer said, his voice a dry whisper like ashes stirred by the wind. "She does not look like much." Vorlag bowed his head subserviently. "My lord Valerius, she is stronger than she appears. The bond is powerful." Valerius, the Shadow King of the Ember Covenant, glided toward her. He reached out a hand, his long, pale fingers tipped with black nails, and brushed them against the silver chain on her collarbone. She flinched, a fresh wave of agony washing over her. "Excellent," Valerius hissed. "We will begin the ritual at the peak. With this bond as our conduit, we will drain the Alpha King's power and offer it to the eternal flame. By sunrise, he will be a hollow shell, and I will take his throne." He looked down at her, his red eyes glowing with cold amusement. "You should be honored, little Omega. Your worthless life will finally have a purpose. You will be the instrument of a new age." They dragged her up the mountain, toward a jagged peak where the wind howled like a tortured spirit. At the summit was a circle of dark, rune-etched stones. This was their altar, their place of sacrifice. They chained her in the center of the circle. Valerius began to chant in a guttural language that made her skin crawl. The runes on the stones began to glow with a sickly red light. The silver chains grew hotter, the pain becoming an all-consuming fire. The last thread of her bond with Kale was stretching, fraying, about to snap. And then she heard it. A howl. It was not the howl of an ordinary wolf. This was a sound of pure, unrestrained fury, a promise of retribution that rolled down the mountain and shook the very stones beneath her. It was the howl of a king, the howl of her mate. He was here. Chaos erupted. Kale and his warriors descended upon the peak like an avalanche. They were not men, but blurs of shadow and steel, moving with preternatural speed and strength. The clash of metal on metal rang through the night. The screams of Vorlag's men were cut short. Kale was a storm of righteous vengeance at the center of it all. His golden eyes were blazing, and he moved like a vengeful god, cutting a swath through the Ember Covenant soldiers. Valerius ceased his chant, turning to face the Alpha King. "You are too late, Kale. The ritual is begun. Her life is already forfeit." He drew a wicked obsidian blade and met Kale's charge. The two kings clashed, their power erupting in waves that cracked the very air. Alara could only watch, helpless, chained to the altar. The red energy from the runes was flowing into the silver chains, channeling through her, trying to sever the bond. The pain was unbearable. She felt Kale stumble, a wave of weakness hitting him as the dark magic took hold. Valerius laughed, a triumphant, grating sound. "You see? Your sentiment has undone you. Your power is mine." He raised his blade for a final blow. Seeing Kale in danger, seeing him falter because of her, broke something deep inside Alara. The years of abuse, the lifetime of being called worthless, the agony of the silver, and the fierce, protective love she felt for the king who had shown her kindness. It all coalesced into a single, explosive point of pure rage. No, she would not be a weakness. She would not be a victim. She would not let him be harmed. A power she never knew she possessed, a core of Arctic cold that had lain dormant in her soul, awakened. It surged up from the depths of her being, a tidal wave of ice and fury. With a scream that was no longer human, that was the shriek of a blizzard given voice, she shattered the silver chains. An explosion of brilliant crystalline light erupted from her. A wave of absolute cold blasted outward from the center of the circle. The glowing red runes fizzled and died, coated in a thick layer of frost. The Ember Covenant soldiers who were still standing were frozen instantly, becoming statues of ice. Vorlag, who had been scrambling toward her, was caught in the blast. He was encased in solid, clear ice, his face a permanent mask of greed and terror. The world went silent, save for the howling of the wind. Alara stood in the center of the circle, no longer shivering, no longer in pain. She was glowing, bathed in a soft blue-white light. Frost patterns, intricate and beautiful like ferns on a winter window, spread across her skin. Her eyes, once a timid gray, now shone with the light of a frozen star. Valerius stared at her, his red eyes wide with shock and disbelief. What are you? Kale, too, was looking at her, his golden eyes filled not with fear, but with utter, breathtaking awe. Alara turned her gaze to the Shadow King. The fear was gone. The self-doubt was gone. All that remained was a cold, clear certainty. "You called me worthless," she said, her voice calm and clear, yet carrying the chilling power of a glacier. "You called me an instrument." She took a step toward him, the ground freezing beneath her bare feet. "You were wrong." She raised her hand, and a spear of pure, solid ice formed in her grasp. She leveled it at Valerius. "I am the Winter Queen, and you will not touch my king." With that, she drove the ice spear forward, not at Valerius, but at the ground at his feet. The ice spread, racing toward him, encasing his legs, climbing his body. He cried out, trying to break free with his dark magic, but her cold was absolute, pure, and it smothered his corrupting flames. Kale, recovering, seized the opportunity. He lunged, his own blade a blur of motion, and the fight was over. Silence descended on the frozen peak. The battle was done. The light began to fade from Alara, the frost patterns on her skin receding. It wasn't the searing fire of its creation, but a deep, healing heat that settled into her soul. As his lips touched the mark, he let out a sharp gasp. He pulled back, his eyes wide. On his own skin, just above his heart, a matching mark was forming. It bloomed into existence, a swirling pattern of a wolf and a crescent moon, glowing with the fierce, molten gold of his eyes. The bond was complete. No longer a one-sided claim, but a circle, a perfect, unbreakable union. He looked from the mark on his chest to her, a slow, wondrous smile spreading across his face. It was like watching the sunrise after a long, dark night. It transformed his harsh features into something breathtakingly beautiful. "Now you have claimed me, my Winter Queen," he said, his voice soft with reverence. She reached up, her trembling fingers tracing the new mark on his chest. It felt warm, alive, a part of him that was now a part of her. "Mine," she whispered, echoing the first word he had ever spoken to her. His smile widened. He held her close, wrapping them both in his great fur cloak. The world outside their small circle of warmth and love ceased to exist. All the pain, all the fear, all the years of being nothing washed away in the profound certainty of his embrace. They returned not to a simple pack hall, but to a kingdom. A vast, sprawling city carved from the heart of a mountain, lit by glowing crystals and warmed by geothermal vents. Great banners bearing the sigil of a golden-eyed wolf hung from bridges that spanned dizzying chasms. It was a place of power and ancient majesty. His people, his warriors, his court, gathered in the immense throne room. They were a formidable assembly of alphas, betas, and powerful wolves, their eyes all fixed on her as Kale led her to the twin thrones on the dais. She felt a flicker of the old fear, the instinct to shrink, to become invisible. These were kings and queens in their own right, and she was... Who was she? Kale must have felt her hesitation through the bond. He squeezed her hand, his warmth a steadying anchor. "You are their queen," his thought came to her, clear and strong. "You are my everything." He stopped before the thrones and turned to face his people. His voice boomed through the cavernous hall, filled with a pride and love that was undeniable. "For 500 years, our throne has been half empty," he declared. "For 500 years, I have waited for the other half of my soul. Today, the wait is over." He turned to her, his golden eyes blazing for all to see. He knelt before her. The Alpha King, the most powerful wolf in the world, knelt at her feet. A collective gasp went through the hall. "I present to you Alara, my fated mate, my bond claimed, the Winter Queen of the North." He took her hand and pressed it to his lips. "Your queen." A moment of stunned silence, and then the hall erupted. A roar of approval, of joyous howls and thunderous applause shook the very foundations of the mountain. They were not looking at an Omega. They were looking at the woman who had brought their king to his knees, the woman whose power shone from her like a beacon, the woman who wore his matching mark. He rose and led her to her throne, a magnificent seat carved from pale, moon-kissed rock next to his own dark obsidian one. She sat down, the cold stone feeling strangely comfortable. Right. She looked out at the sea of faces. They were looking at her with respect, with awe, with acceptance. She was not an outcast here. She was not invisible. She was home. Kale sat beside her, his large hand finding hers, their fingers lacing together. The two marks, his gold and her silver blue, pulsed in a gentle, synchronous rhythm. She leaned her head against his massive shoulder, breathing in his scent of pine and power, feeling the steady, reassuring strength of him. The cold was finally gone, not just from her skin, but from her soul. In its place was a warmth she had never imagined possible, a love that was a fortress, and a power that was her own. She was no longer Alara the worthless. She was Alara, the Winter Queen, and she was finally, truly seen.